Welcome to another exciting edition of Blogging Heads. I am one of your two hosts, Ezra Klein, and the other is Julian Sanchez. Hello, Julian.
Hello, Julian. You know, I feel really attacked by your tone of voice here, Ezra. I just think it's reprehensible that you. I'm this close to hanging. No, not really. I just.
Okay, you
want to get on
YouTube for a
YouTube.
moment.
Hey, Ezra.
Okay. How are you?
I'm not bad. Yourself?
I can't complain. I am here in the beautiful American Prospect offices, where behind me you can see gigantic blow-ups of our covers, and so we're getting some good advertising out of this, and I assume we're going to be channeling a large amount of money into the Blogging Head World Headquarters bank account quite soon. That's
Excellent.
an offshore account, right?
I hope so. I think there's some sort of tax break, but Robert Wright is dead for legal purposes for the next 3 years.
Speaking of offshore, in what is a... There's your segue for you.
What?
I wanted to talk about first for a little bit. This week, Jonah Goldberg had an interesting post in response to something that I and also the New Republic writer John Cohn wrote about how Americans are not, both have not set up European-style social welfare state and are also not going to.
Right.
And he argued that what people like John and I don't take enough into account is the role of culture. I think, as he put it, we are not... toady, throne-sucking, this and that. But the actual argument he's making there is a little bit more normal than I think his rhetoric made it sound, which is that, you know, Americans are individualistic and rugged and this and that, and for those reasons we are constitutionally, and I mean constitutionally in the sense of how we are made up, not particularly amenable to a large welfare state. And Julian, you're a libertarian, and so I think the purest expression of American individuality, and I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. There's actually a interesting study that's sort of the fountainhead of kind of cultural psychology. It was done back in the late 70s.
Fountainhead being a intended pun there, or no?
Semi-intended. It was a consequence of human action, but not of human design.
Well, I ran with it.
Right. Oh, God. This guy, Geert Hofstede, who's a sociologist who back in the 70s did a kind of huge multinational survey through IBM employees. So, I mean, the sample is obviously kind of constrained, but on a range of issues trying to gauge the kind of attitudinal differences between people from different countries and different cultures.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the findings from that's held up pretty well over time is that on a couple of the dimensions of sort of cultural personality that he talks about, uncertainty avoidance and individualism, America essentially consistently ranks at the top on individualism, which is to say whether people define themselves primarily in terms of their kind of internal projects and desires or in terms of their relations to groups. And uncertainty avoidance, we almost always rank very low.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not obviously dispositive in itself. I mean, even lower than we on uncertainty avoidance is Sweden. But these are two things I think you see pretty consistently as a kind of part of America's cultural DNA. And if you look back to, I mean, even Tocqueville, writing about American culture not that long after the founding, he found this. You heard the same kind of thing, the same sort of spirit of independence. And I think it's sort of built into our kind of foundational myths, right? I mean, America was not kind of a nation stretching back through time immemorial, right? I mean, remember the sort of 19th century nationalist movements were about kind of fabricating this eternal past, and we had a very clear kind of starting point, and the narrative there was about America as almost an adventure, as a place where all sorts of people, not bound together necessarily by any kind of deep ties of blood, all kind of came to get away and do something different. So I think that has an effect. I mean, I think also even constitutionally, perhaps even in the the kind of more colloquial sense of our legal institutions, it's not just that the Constitution specifies limited powers, but the structure of divided government we have, I think, is more amenable to thinking of government as something with very sort of specific purposes, right? It's not that you have this unitary government that it's very easy to think about as a kind of all-purpose problem solver. What you have are this separation of state government, federal government, and with each having kind of specified roles to play in a way that I think at least has slowed our tendency to think of the government as this kind of institution that is the kind of master institution of society that is supposed to do whatever needs doing.
I think I would place less of the emphasis right there on what it has made the government look like, and more, in fact, on what it is actually made out of the government. I mean, we have a two-party system which has made it much, much harder for either socialist or robust libertarian parties to arise. We just don't have the sort of ideological spectrum which other countries have had, and which have made it much easier for larger ideas to migrate into the mainstream in a parliamentary democracy. The need to get, say, the Socialist Party on your side makes you much more amenable to the Socialist Party's ideas. You know, and I think it is interesting. The history stuff fascinates me a little bit, and, you know, it's obviously impossible to separate out causalities here, so you can't really get, I think, a very good beat on it. But certainly I was thinking about when you were talking a moment ago, and have seen some historians make this argument that the Europeans had so much more actual crazed uncertainty and risk. I mean, revolutions and world wars and so forth, and the relative safety and security of the American experience has had a sort of amplifying effect. It has allowed us to put more of our sort of risk into economic matters and required less sort of government security, because the threats were never, or were rarely, as both existential and real as they were at different times in Europe, and particularly at different times in Europe when these social welfare states were in fact constructed. Now that is a little bit complicated by the case of Canada, which has a much more European welfare state and is, you know, in a similar geographical situation to America. Right. I mean, one thing that you also can't take out of the equation that has had a really massive impact is race in this country.
Sure.
Many scholars will argue that the reason we don't have such things as a universal healthcare system is simply that in this country, redistribution was often seen as giving the money of whites to blacks. And we also have much more of a concept of the undeserving poor. I mean, also on studies to sort of back up what you were saying, or buttress what you were saying about how Americans view risk. We tend to view the poor, and particularly before welfare reform, as much more of the undeserving poor. Sure. In America, if you're poor, it is often considered a failing on your part.
Yeah,
in much higher numbers than is true in Europe, where poverty and, for that matter, riches are often considered much more a function of luck. Yeah, which I think has a really large effect on it.
I think maybe part of that is that certainly, you know, sorting out the direction of causality here is always thorny. But I mean, there's a way to tie this into, you know, sort of our origins and kind of Calvinist escapees from Europe, and, you know, that doctrine of wealth as a sign of the elect. I think what you were saying about the European experience has a lot to it. I mean, there wasn't a kind of domestic American specific experience of the transition, the destabilizing transition to, you know, a kind of more mercantile industrial order. And maybe also it's that having seen, I guess, the idea kind of built into the national DNA of this was a kind of experiment where people were starting over, may have done something to erase the sense of social inequality as being, you know, frequently this arbitrary thing that has to do with bloodlines and, you know, what position you were born into. I think, you know, sort of, again, you know, the European background is more attuned to this idea of these sort of long history where privilege and wealth were utterly arbitrary, and it was easier, you know, I think in the U.S. context to think of it as something that people, you know, coming here with nothing, you know, made for themselves as a result of their merits.
Which is interesting because more and more you're having studies come out showing that mobility in this country is becoming compromised, and that we're in fact seeing less of it than we are in many of the European countries. You can find those at CPR and CAP and others, and you know, I don't think that has fully been absorbed into the American psyche, that we actually do have a lot less mobility than we did a generation ago, 2 generations ago. We've become much more stultified. The other interesting thing, you mentioned Sweden, which I didn't know and had different opinions on that, but which I have been thinking about a lot. I'm actually doing a panel at Cato, which is an institution more on your side of the spectrum, next week on what we can or cannot learn from the Scandinavian states. And one interesting thing about not only Sweden but Denmark and the others is that they've created large government with large tax structures, but it is very, very focused on promoting economic dynamism. As I remember, the Heritage Index ranks them as freer economies than we are, and they do have these, you know, expansive welfare states, very, very heavy job retraining, unemployment insurance, universal and, in fact, socialized health care and all the rest. But what they do very overtly is to create enough security that they encourage risk-taking.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, that the idea being that you can take all the economic risks you want because if you fail, you will never fall too far, which I mean, I being a sort of social democratic guy myself think is interesting, and it's also an interesting, given I didn't know what you had said that they rank differently on the sort of ideological measures than the rest of Europe. It makes more sense knowing that their welfare state has evolved somewhat differently than say the French welfare state, which in fact is somewhat more has a lot more labor lock-in, a lot more is much more focused on sort of wide security rather than in your job and in your position, rather than the Swedish welfare state, which is focused on sort of fundamental security, but your job and your position and can change due to globalization or whatever else. And that may be a worthwhile, that's worth looking into.
I mean, the difference I was talking about was actually more of an attitudinal than an ideological one. It has to do with your sort of disposition toward risk, whether you...
Right, no, that's what I mean.
Right.
The Swedish welfare state has evolved to encourage a certain type of economic risk-taking,
right.
Or at least they believe it has. It has not been true in other large welfare states like France or Germany,
right.
which tend to not encourage a lot of risk-taking, which have much stronger sort of labor protections and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously there's a better, and I mean, I'm kind of a minimalist myself, but there are obviously better and worse ways to do this sort of thing. I'm not sure there's not something to what you're saying about the kind of idea of a baseline providing a kind of
right.
A position from which people, in a sense, become less afraid of risk in a way because there's sort of less far to fall. Although I also think I don't know how much of what works in Sweden is necessarily a model for what will work in the U.S. I mean, it's just
sure.
a different country.
You should come to my panel.
I will definitely come to your panel.
That, I think, gives us a good segue here at minute 12, because we should move on, to possibly a large expansion of the welfare state here. Mm-hmm. Now, Julian and I have in the past argued, and I've argued with Will as well, Julian and I have done this more in the old media. Are blogs old media now? They must be,
yeah,
right?
legacy media.
All right. Yeah, legacy media blogs about liberaltarians and whether or not there's room for compromises. And, the sort of the rocks upon which this argument always sort of crashes is healthcare, which is the primary objective of most progressives, certainly of me. And, it requires a very large state expansion. Now, libertarians, Michael Cannon, Cato, Arnold Kling, others tend to approach the American healthcare system from the position that we have a moral hazard problem because insurance actually insulates us from the cost of every individual unit of healthcare. Right. We overuse hugely what we should instead do, but we end up paying for it all. We pay for it through premiums, we pay for it through right. taxes, whatever. So what we should do is put a lot more of that spending up front. You should have to pay for your care when you get it, which will make you more price sensitive, a smarter consumer, et cetera, et cetera. Somebody like me replies to that, look, like, if you just do that indiscriminately, the poor are going to be really, really hurt. The risk sharing for them is going to be much, much higher than it is for the rich. And also the health outcomes of that could be bad. If they stop taking their hypertensive medication, not only are they going to get a heart attack, but they are going to cost the system more. So on a variety of levels, that's a problem. But Jason Furman, who's an economist at the centrist Hamilton Project, brought out a paper this week, which I think is interesting and which I've thought along the same lines of for a while and that could furnish something of a compromise, which is why I want to run it by Julian. And the idea is what he calls progressive cost sharing. You have something like HSAs where, or no, here's how it works. You have 50% cost share. So whatever, if I go to the doctor and it costs me $150, I pay $75. And you have that 50% cost share up into 7.5% of income. So once you've exploded that cap, at which point you're not talking basic care anymore generally, you're talking you're really sick and you need treatment. At that point, the out-of-pocket end of this goes away. There's progressivity down the income line. If you make up to 150% of the poverty line, there's no cost sharing. And between 150 and 200%, it's only up to 5% of income. That's a lot of numbers. But the point of it is that you can create a progressive system in which people do, in fact, have to pay for a lot more of their care up front, and hopefully will then use less of it. A lot of the studies show, a lot of the data shows that if we cut back on the amount of health care we use, we would be better off. Now, the other wrinkle to that, which I'll end on here and let Julian respond to it, is that I think, and Jason suggests, but I'm very, very big on this, that you need to be smart about what you do and don't put into the cost sharing. So certain medications we really, really want to encourage adherence to. We really want people to take statins for cholesterol, medicine for hypertensive things. We've done many, many studies showing that if you take folks off of that, not only do they have more hospitalizations, ambulance visits, and death, but all the cost savings that happen by taking folks off, I didn't mean take them off, I meant upping their cost sharing quite a bit. They use less of it. They have more negative health outcomes and end up erasing their cost savings because of it. But I'm interested to hear I'd say you exempt things like that and like chronic care for diabetes, things like that, which we just want people to do and we don't think we're going to save money on by encouraging them to do less of. But what is a system like, how does that vibe with you, Julian? What would you think about a proposal like that?
Well, I mean, a couple things. Let me sort of step back and make a meta point, which is it's something I've always found odd about the American healthcare debate is that it's always framed in terms of insurance and coverage, even when we're talking about something like, how to make it more sort of consumer driven and have people pay more out of pocket for these kind of routine expenses. It's still in the context of a kind of language of insurance, which is this sort of risk spreading tool, when a lot of what we're talking about here is not really about risk spreading at all. I mean, you're not covering your annual checkup to any extent. It's not really about spreading risk.
It's about coverage,
right? And I think it almost muddles things that we're talking about. Universal health insurance, or whatever, when it seems like the real issue is the scope of coverage. The other thing is, it actually seems, assuming we're going to be covering these things, it actually seems a little perverse to me that the thing you would have people pay out of pocket is, that the first, $1,000 or whatever, where that what that's going to be is probably the yearly checkup with the kind of routine preventative screenings, and it seems like to the extent that you're talking about how cost sharing of this kind sort of creates weird sort of problems with that and just causes sort of unwise patterns of healthcare consumption, I would think you'd actually kind of want to subsidize that first screening, not because you're subsidizing insurance, but just as a kind of means-tested, straight-up layout to encourage people to get preventative care, so we don't need to hit them in the emergency room later. And then the copay element, or the part paid out of pocket, kicks in later.
Right. There actually are plans that work like that, which I've long been a fan of. They're called donut hole plans, and you can actually do it without the other side of the hole. But you don't pay anything on the first $1,500 of care, and then it kicks in. And Medicare Part D actually works like this, which is a Medicare prescription drug benefit, which is sort of dumb because seniors simply need the pharmaceuticals. But yes, I think that's a smart objection. Yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, you can also exempt things like basic care and mammogram screenings and so forth. I mean, that's probably the direction I'd go, where these things don't cost money. Like you have 5 basic visits a year, and if you use them, you use them, but they don't cost you extra. But assuming you don't want to begin, I started thinking about that and thinking of all the things I'd exempt, and I began wondering exactly what I was keeping in under the cost sharing. So I think I gotta leave something alone. But I think your objection there is correct.
Yeah, I mean, also, it makes a lot more. Insofar as you're talking about it in the language of insurance, it also obviously makes the least sense to subsidize. Things like routine checkups, because for the same reason your car insurance handles accidents, but you don't insure for routine maintenance or filling up your gas tank. If you're just talking about it in terms of providing coverage and not about an insurance system, it makes more sense. A couple of things. I'm actually curious what you think about the linkage to employment. It seems like the thing that we could do to sort of most fix our healthcare system. I don't know most, but one big thing we could do is that assuming we're not moving to a fully sort of single payer system soon, it seems like we have this sort of hybrid where we get neither the benefits of a fully socialized system nor those of a genuinely marketized system. And it seems like one reason is this sort of arbitrary, weird linkage between employment and healthcare. And it's like you'd never set it up that way. If you were saying,
No.
let's design a healthcare system, no one, you would wonder what they were smoking if someone said, I've got an idea. Why don't we just have it tied to your job? So, if you change jobs, you change insurance.
There's nothing I loathe in American healthcare so much as the employment link. A while back, I had a forum on the American Prospects website about what should be the minimum progressives will accept in healthcare reform. And my first point was that it has to sever the employment link. When I talk about this sort of cost-sharing system, I think of it actually in something fairly similar to a single-payer proposal, where that would be the compromise. It would be a cost-sharing system with sort of the attendant. The attendant focus on consumer-driven medicine that the right likes, but it would have to move into a real sort of full national pool, which would be the left end of this. But yes, one way or the other, you have to get healthcare out of employment. You just have to. I mean, it came about, and I think people don't really realize this. There's a sort of intelligent design fallacy with healthcare that people believe, very wise bureaucrats somewhere sat down and said, all right, well, we've got to build this healthcare system, and people need their healthcare, so how are we going to do it? And along the way, they made some wrong decisions and some right ones, but we've got
this is just like an atavistic holdover from World War II tax policy.
It's a World War II tax quirk. What happened is that we had wage and price controls and to prevent war profiteering, and so folks couldn't make, companies couldn't make a bunch of new profits, but what they could do, what the Labor Relations Board, or maybe it's a different board, ruled was that you could plow that back into employee benefits, and it would be and it wouldn't be taxed. And then a bit later, it became completely tax deductible. That quirk was kept in, and once it was tax deductible, that stayed. Then that gave the unions really weird incentives because, number one, there was a ruling that even when they couldn't bargain for salary increases during World War II, they could bargain for benefit increases. But meanwhile, what did the unions want to do, right? They want to increase union density. They want to organize more workers. So they did not fight for universal health care. What they fought to get was health care for the people they were trying to organize, so they would give them more benefits for being in the union. I think, in retrospect, that was quite short-sighted. But, it wasn't malicious, but it was short-sighted.
Sure.
And so on all levels, this was it was a bad idea that was just a quirk of the tax code, and that ended up being codified because, various stakeholders began to really like it. Unions needed it for a while to help their organizing. Insurers really liked it. I mean, a lot of profit grew up around it. I will say, too, on the insurance issue, I have a real problem with the way progressives talk about health care, which is that when we talk about universal health care, we define the issue as one of access, and the 45 million uninsured are a really huge problem, and it's like a moral stain on the nation. But the big issue in the system is actually cost. If you insured everyone tomorrow, you just subsidize them all, you could do that, but we all, not just because of them, we're just not going to be able to afford the healthcare system in a couple of years, in a couple of decades, and we need to do something to arrest cost growth. But I will say that I think folks on your end of the aisle get a little bit hung up on the idea that health insurance is not in fact like normal insurance and is in fact something much more like insulation. That appears to be what people want. It's sort of confusing that we've kept the word insurance for it, but the question isn't I don't think that ends up being, because I think most people just associate health insurance with what they have. And the question is if you can move it away from insulation to something more like in a cost-sharing program where you pay, instead of paying premium money for insurance, you pay money for health care. But the insurance distinction, I think, is a little bit neither here nor there, because even though what we have is not what is often commonly referred to as insurance, people, I feel like some folks like Michael Cannon, when they say that, they expect people to say, oh my God, no, I would much rather have something like what I have for if my house burns down. But in fact, people want this sort of insulation, and the question is whether or not you can either argue them out of that position or whether or not you should.
Well,
but do you think a universal plan with this sort of thing would work for you?
I don't think obviously it would depend on the details. Let me sort of step back for a second. I think the reason I kind of harp on this distinction is that I do think there are actually different issues, right? I mean, there's a question. There are two functions at least, right? I mean, there is a risk spreading function, and then there's a kind of subsidy function where the concern is that we just want to make sure that poor people do not lack health care. And so I like the conceptual separation because I think it helps think more clearly about what you're trying to do with different kinds of measures and whether it makes sense to have different functions combined under one roof, as it were, or to do something else. Ron Bailey has offered a proposal that I think is interesting, and I wouldn't necessarily object to as a kind of better than what we've got now, which is the idea of just sort of providing in effect healthcare vouchers. You require everyone to get health insurance, and if you can't afford your own, we'll buy it for you in essence, or give you the means with which to buy it. And that's something I would be actually okay with. I understand that we're not anytime soon going to be okay with just letting people go without care. So we're going to be subsidizing that. But I'd like to see it done in a way that provides or preserves both the kind of autonomy that puts people in control of their healthcare, but also sort of preserves the good aspects of the market system and what it produces.
I guess without getting too deep into the weeds on this, and we should probably move on in a second anyway.
Let me actually just throw out one thing you do mention in your prospect piece, and also that Furman, I think, alludes to near the end of his proposal, which is that, in a way it's almost weird. We're talking a lot about cost control kind of on this low end, right? We're talking about cost control on these this first or second $1,000 or whatever it is, when that's not where it seems like the huge ballooning cost increases in the next 50 years are not going to be, in people getting or not getting the extra, mammogram or whatever, right? I mean, it's going to be, right. Sort of huge, expensive stuff that's going to be driving this, and it seems to me like the real problem is figuring out how to control that stuff. I mean, not necessarily the good stuff, but as you point out, this sort of futile care at the end, where we have this sort of attitude that as long as hope, a glimmer of hope remains, you have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to squeeze out a few percentage points of probability of getting someone to survive for another 6 months. And I mean, this is Ramesh Panuru's idea of a party of death is one that I think is really apt for me. I think I'd sign up for it, because in addition to being very pro-choice, I think we need to sort of start re-examining some of our attitudes toward what kind of expenditures make sense. Which I wonder whether, most people who are on the left on healthcare like this sort of rhetoric, this sort of absolute rhetoric where we say healthcare is this kind of right, and no one should ever have to be denied treatment because they're not they're not able to pay, and it's this sort of intrinsic human right, which I just wonder how much pressure that comes on under as we have more and more technology that at a greater and greater cost can extend your life by increasingly small increments. So is there some point where we say, there are margins along which if you want to pay for another month, between the age of 90 and 91 or something, you can do that, but we're not going to consider that something that you're entitled to.
So a couple things here. One, on the Bailey plan, the reason a plan like that doesn't work is it actually falls afoul of what I was talking about a moment ago. It is a plan that does nothing but improve access. I mean, you could get to universal care there, but you'd simply be subsidizing people.
That's true.
I mean, you said there, like, I wonder, I'd like to keep the goods of the private sector here, the goods of the market, but I found, like, when I actually interrogate people on, like, what the goods of the market are here, like, nobody seems to actually know what the way insurance works particularly. What the insurers add, what their value add is very, very unclear, and probably actually not terribly existent, particularly when we're talking about basic care. So I wouldn't support that plan, not because it wouldn't be better than what we have, but because it would just fall apart in a couple of years. You can't finance it. Second thing, you're right. The expenditures do come on what we call the 80-20 rule. The 20% of the patients are responsible for 80% of the costs. In healthcare, it's actually higher. It's like an 88 rule or something. Furman runs the numbers and says you could actually achieve a fair number of savings even within those. That X number of the folks who are over that, who are in that 20%, are still under 7.5% of their income. But this is what I talked about, moving it into a universal structure, because in fact the only proven way to pay less for healthcare, the reason American healthcare costs double what any other industrialized nation pays per unit of care, is that double what any other industrialized nation pays per person is that we pay so much more per unit of care. An MRI here is so much more than an MRI in Germany. Pharmaceuticals here are 60% costlier than they are in Canada. And the reason is simple to anybody who understands economics. The other countries use their large bargaining power to bargain down prices in the way Walmart does and the way we expect large institutions do. We not only don't allow our government to do that, we don't even allow Medicare to do that. Right. I think you can create cost savings on the demand side by creating this sort of cost sharing we're talking about, by undoing the insulation a bit. I think that the reason I think this is a compromise is because the other end of that is that you've got to squeeze providers more than you do. You just have to. I mean, it really is we can't afford it over time. And we will make decisions, but the decision is not going to be, given the values of this country, given what we've expressed, given what other countries have, that more and more and more people, it's 60 million and 80 million people don't have insurance. We're going to have to figure out a way to bring down these costs, particularly given how much more we pay than anybody else. I mean, literally, it is double what anyone else pays, and we have 45 million uninsured, which they don't. So the spending on the median insured American is so unbelievably and atypically high that you actually, I think, do need sort of government or large sort of regional associations, whatever you want to call it. You need to begin squeezing the providers with size. And then the last thing is about how do you ration? That's a tough one. I mean, you can do it by income. You can do it, as some other countries do, by what we consider need. Part of the issue is that it's never clear what the final 6 months are, that it looks like we can go back in mortality data and say, okay, what happened in the last 6 months of their life, but you can't go forward in that, except for pretty rare cases. A lot of time people have a condition they could die from, or you could save them. But, at some point we're going to have to sort of sit down as a society and begin making more, more decisions on that. But I honestly, I've got no answers on how that'll work. I do hope we will just say on what we do and don't know if it works. We need a lot more data on what actual treatments work and which ones don't. A lot of things we do, a lot of the angioplasties, a lot of the heart bypasses in this country are completely unnecessary, just completely not useful. And we actually need to put a lot more money into seeing what does work and what doesn't. And even, all this insurance data we have on cutting down on insurance and sharing more of the cost, that cuts down on how much care you use, and that doesn't actually affect your health outcomes. It comes from this multi-million-dollar 15-year RAND health insurance study that randomly assigned people into different health insurance categories. We need to do another of those. We should spend a couple $100 million on it, and it would repay itself 100-fold. It would be fantastic. I'll let you have the last word if you want it, or we can move on to the TSA stuff, because I feel like I'm getting too deep into the weeds of health policy here.
Well, I've already violated my cardinal rule right up there with don't play poker with someone who does card tricks, is don't debate healthcare with Ezra. So there's actually a ton there, and rather than try and respond to it, I think I'll let you have the last word, and we can move on to TSA stuff.
TSA, why don't you explain the situation?
Yeah.
Also, healthcare, awesome.
There was there's Walter Murphy is a Princeton emeritus law professor who, I guess a while back now, and recently went public with it, was sort of stopped at an airport when he was taking a flight, and was essentially told he'd been sort of selected, he'd been held up, that he was on a watch list. And the employee said something to the effect of, well, do you do any peace marches? We put a lot of people on the list for things like that. And he said he had, in fact, given a speech where he'd attacked George Bush, and so he was sort of protesting this kind of politicization of the terror watch list. And the more people looked into it, Ryan Singal, who's a very good reporter at Wired, kind of did a little digging and kind of sort of gave it a sniff test, basically, and said this doesn't make a lot of sense, not least because there's no way on earth that the employee at the airline counter has any real clear sense of how TSA is making the decisions about who gets on the list and off it.
That's an interesting point.
So yeah, this is probably not the case. You've been hearing since essentially since the beginning of these watch lists or the expansion of these watch lists after 9/11, stories about some peace activists being stopped or delayed because of their involvement in that. And the truth is, who knows? I do feel like at this point there are sort of so many people who are public figures who have been involved in this that if it were routine to be putting people on watch lists for criticizing President Bush, we would have sort of hundreds of these stories every day, and not these occasional ones.
That's it. Yeah, that's a good point too.
Now, on the other hand, I mean, I think certainly one can understand why stuff like this gets picked up, and I mean, it sort of fits an entirely plausible narrative sort of about this administration, about both its secrecy, which grows. I mean, the TSA process is really mysterious. I mean, there is a procedure to sort of get off if your name is mistakenly on it. It's like, so it should be someone else, and you've been misidentified because you have similar names. It's not at all clear what the process is if you are, it is you that's on the list, but you don't think you should be there, or you haven't done anything, or you don't know why you're there. And so both the lack of transparency in that process, and also the kind of obvious intolerance of criticism of this administration, I mean, the way that they do public events where people with any kind of anti-war T-shirt are kind of kept to the side or not let in, and they kind of cherry-pick their audiences at these town hall meetings that they're supposed to be doing. So the narrative fits in a way that explains, I think, why this got picked up and ran and spread around the blogosphere so quickly. It's a lot like that story from a couple of years back where a student claimed the Secret Service had come and investigated him because he had tried to check Mao's Little Red Book out of a school library, and it turned out he had just sort of made it up. But it went around because it sort of fit into people's sort of maybe justified fears about the extent of the Patriot Act and other sort of expansions of the national security apparatus.
I mean, I'd say too, some of these things went around because, one thing that happened in the aftermath of 9/11, or more to the point, the aftermath of 9/11, is that things like it's such a weird time, and things like the terror alert codes, I mean, the orange and the green and the red and the yellow and all that, where you turn on Fox News and, like, in the corner, there'd be this little, like, what is it, today's terror alert?
It's like the weather. Or green clovers, yeah.
Right. But, I mean, and it was legitimately terrifying to people, I think, for a while, and what happened is they began to become inured, as we had a lot of raises, and maybe all the raises were, like, completely legitimate, God knows. I certainly don't, although I don't believe they were. But as we began to have a lot of these raises happen, then nothing would occur. People began to... There was a sort of like an inoculation. They began to become less and less sensitive to each one.
Right. The
and then over time they began to believe maybe these are just being sort of politically manipulated. And so not only did it fit the frame, but I mean it's sort of a sad thing because when there is this much mistrust of the government, that we believe they would so cavalierly use what should be security measures, that they would cheapen security measures. Because I mean, imagine if such a story were true. That you actually have these sort of desk agents who are dealing with people on the watch list and know that they're on there for peace marches. I mean, they're going to be more likely to create exceptions and let people through and try to help people get off and possibly put everybody in danger. And I don't know what the answer is except to have like more honest administrations. But I think the pickup on this story is both indicative of the times, but something worrying in that I'm not a huge fan of the police state, but obviously there's a certain amount of danger that we are or potentially could be in, and you would want this sort of thing to be you would want to believe that this sort of thing is in fact depoliticized, but clearly on an underlying level, very very few of us do believe that. And down the road that could have some real consequences. I don't have a way to fix it or something different people should be doing, but it's certainly a sad reflection on the times.
Yeah, no, I remember about a month back, Joe Lieberman gave a speech where he was saying, there's a sign of something deeply wrong when so many people are distrustful of the very clear-cut intelligence about the threat posed by Iran's weapons programs. And I think, in context, it seemed clear that what he meant by this is, isn't it terrible how kind of paranoid and distrustful people have become of the administration, I guess.
Right, and of Joe Lieberman, for that matter.
Right. The last decent man. It's tragic. But yeah, I mean, obviously that does indicate that something is wrong, and maybe it has to do with the massive intelligence failure last time we heard there was a huge threat from a country around there somewhere.
I'll say too, it's fascinating. I was in a cab the other day listening to Limbaugh, and he was talking about, I think this had to do with prosecutor gate, but he was talking about how like the real problem with this administration is that on every level they're too nice. They won't punish their enemies ever. They just give Congress whatever it wants. They always they just roll over and cede ground and are willing to just bend over backwards to assuage the fear and concerns of their critics. And and this will happen to anybody when they listen to right-wing radio, or I assume to right-wingers when they listen to left-wing radio or read my blog. It is remarkable the degree to which the two bases in this country are now operating off of different sets of facts. I mean, literally different ways of understanding the world. I could see if if I believe that Bush's sort of unitary executive theories are really bad, and the fact that he's so secretive is really bad, and the fact that he wouldn't talk to Congress about these things is really bad, and the fact that he wouldn't level with the American people is really bad, and the people on the right said, no, you don't understand, this is a time of grave national danger, and the fact that he, is pretty secretive is really good, and the fact that he doesn't talk to Congress is good, we need a flexible executive, the fact that he, is this or that. I mean, you could have a different value judgment operating off of the same set of basic facts. What we have is not that. You have different sets of facts which are leading to very different value judgments, and that's concerning as well. I mean, look, maybe this stuff will all go away with the next administration, but I remember the Clinton period somewhat, and I mean, here you had a centrist guy, and polarization then is so high, and the hatred was so much, and there wasn't even the threat of terror underlying it. I mean, we were talking about morality, which, an important thing, no doubt, but wasn't quite as existentially threatening as bombs, war, etc. So I don't know how you ratchet any of this down. I don't know how you bring people back together. I'm not one who cares much about partisanship or even about polarization. But the idea that people are this far apart on even how they experience the polity is concerning, I think.
I'm actually kind of wary of using words like existential threat when you're talking about terrorism with anything other than nuclear weapons, basically.
Well, that's what I mean, actually.
Yeah. I mean, I talked actually a couple of years back, right after Adrian Wooldridge from The Economist had written this book, The Right Nation, that was kind of a history of the American conservative movement, and he said,
a good book.
Yeah,
People in Blocking Heads Land.
But he said, he remembered being at CPAC, years ago. This is during the Clinton era, I think, and so saying to himself, well, what do these people have in common? You get the NRA saying, government must stay out of my gun locker, and the social conservatives saying government must, sort of stay in your pants, inspecting, what you're doing with whatever you've got in there. What is actually tying these people together? And his answer was that his video screen and Hillary Clinton's face popped up, and they all kind of booed as one. It seems at times as though, the two-party system kind of creates or forces us to kind of break into two coalitions, and it's not at all clear that American politics really kind of naturally, cleaves that way, right? That two groups are actually in some sort of logical way that flows from the spectrum of opinion, kind of adequately representative of the views people hold. And I think maybe as a function of that, we've come in politics increasingly to define ourselves not so much in terms of what we favor, because that sort of changes over time, and there may be huge differences in that, but in kind of who we hate or who we're against.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think that, particularly people who live in Washington and work in politics, I mean, you work for what is almost purely an ideological magazine. I don't mean that in any way as an insult. I'm pretty ideological myself, as Mickey Kaus will tell you. But, we have these sort of very elaborate superstructures for what we believe. And I think that in general, and probably for me and who knows about you too, the tribalism of all of this outweighs the intellectualism of it. I would like to think that, I came to all of my opinions very honestly and, through weighing the facts. And, maybe on some things I did. I've certainly changed on healthcare as I've learned more about it. But, generally speaking, I grew up, the partisanship of your parents is a very heavy predictor. Your race can be a very heavy predictor. I mean, your demographics are a very heavy predictor. A lot of this is tribal, and even if we did have more political parties, I'm not sure if people would break down in precisely more logical ways, because in the end, only one person can inhabit a lot of different government slots. Even in somewhere like France, we have a lot of positions. There's a prime minister and there's a president, and but you're either with them or against them, or indifferent, and very few people like to be indifferent. And I think in the end, people are pretty quick to make it, your side or mine. But
right.
man,
well,
by the way, have we drifted far from TSA?
We've slid a bit. Do you want to move on?
We should move over to China, I think, because we're over in minute 45.
Sounds good. Okay. Right. So this one is the U.S. has filed a WTO complaint against China, arguing that its lax enforcement of intellectual property laws, its failure to really crack down in a serious way on pirates and bootleggers, essentially constitutes a trade barrier, and they're in violation. So the WTO sanctions should be brought into play to force China to take a more aggressive stance toward IP violations there. I think there are a lot of ways in which this doesn't make sense. I mean, I've actually always sort of had a problem with what guys on your side like to do, which is try and tie trade into essentially a lot of other things that are not in a real direct way connected to trade. So you use sort of trade as a kind of carrot and sanctions as a stick to kind of improve labor standards or environmental standards or whatever else. And so essentially this is a case where that's being done with IP, where essentially it's just the content industries are really eager to have very strong IP protections around the globe, and it's not really obvious that this is, in a clear way, something to do with trade. I mean, it's not like the bootlegs that someone's selling on the street may well have come off some BitTorrent site or something. I mean, you don't know where that came from, or that it's in any real clear way connected to trade, except insofar as it's displacing potential sales. But this is always a thing where music and software companies have been very weird about estimating the damage or the losses they suffer as a result of piracy, where they, essentially what they do is count up the number of times that this piece of software has been pirated or this album has been copied as best they can estimate, and then essentially assume that everyone who downloaded that would have bought a copy at full price.
Right, a one-to-one on sales.
Right, which is silly. I mean, there are college students who sort of fill up whole hard drives with 1,000 albums that they might have bought 2 of if they were actually paying for them all.
I will say that that I don't think it's just people on my side to do that. I mean, there's a lot of corporate stuff, a lot of subsidies go in, but more to the point, I mean, I think that gets to a reality about the way trade interacts with the legislative process, which is that we don't have free trade. We don't even have trade. We have trade deals, and these trade deals have different things inside of them. I mean, look, I find trade itself to be one of the toughest issues to wrap my mind around, and particularly one of the toughest issues to try and figure out how to get to equitable solutions. It's pretty clear that somebody in Dubai needs a job more than somebody in Iowa needs to keep their manufacturing job. But at the same time, you don't want to throw the guy in Iowa out either. And, what I think is actually true is that the union movement, the left, has no idea how to handle trade. Because what we're actually talking about, I mean, we may want to beat back the South Korea trade deal, NAFTA, things like that. But what we're really trying to beat back, I mean, this isn't something I focus on, but is not NAFTA. It's wireless technology. It's shipping containers. I mean, it's the cheaper forms of transport. It's all these different technological advances mainly that have made that have opened up gigantic sectors of the economy to very cheap competition they've never had to deal with before. And whether or not, I mean, you could erect trade barriers, I guess, although that would be pretty hard given how the economy is right now. But what you really can't do is roll that back just through trade deals, even if you do put on labor standards. I mean, those standards may be good, they may be bad, but I don't even think I've seen studies on this and estimates on them, and they would do, if you even got the countries to comply, they would add a couple pennies to the average worker in America. I mean, there's no way to beat that back. Now, that's why I tend to be a pretty heavy advocate of things like Sweden and Denmark's social systems to, do a callback here, which are very good at compensating the losers of trade in order to keep the sort of wider society okay on it. And I think you see the downside dangers of not doing that with sort of the rise of the Lou Dobbs, Lou Dobbs nation, and that worries me a lot. I mean, closing the borders worries me a lot. But yeah, I mean, so I don't know that it's even so much about the wage standards. I mean, obviously the IT stuff is strange, but in the end, the record companies and the, when we're filing suits against China and the WTO and the unions and all this, what they're trying to do is not beat back anything that can be really, I think, taken out through a legislative solution. You're trying to, force back, essentially irrevocable technological advances that have integrated the world. Tom Friedman's book is very funny because he uses a lot of really bad metaphors, and if the world's flat, everybody's farther away. But centrally, he's sort of right. I mean, the integration is happening, and there are all these things that are in fact supercharging it. And nobody, some people think that's good, some people think that's bad. Nobody totally knows what will happen, and nobody totally knows how to deal with it. I mean, my general feeling as a lefty is it's got some bad effects in America. On the other hand, China's development is the greatest economic miracle of the past half century. So, but I don't know where that puts you in how to handle it. I really don't.
I mean, a couple of things. I mean, if I guess sort of, essentially paying off the losers from expanding trade is sort of the only sort of political way to go forward. I mean, maybe that's what we have to do. But I've never thought it made any real sense that if you lose your job because market tastes change and whatever you made goes out of fashion, or because computer technology makes your job redundant or something like that, we just accept that's sort of the breaks. But that if you lose your job because of trade, that's somehow different. So it's like if we find a machine that can more cheaply do what you're doing, technically, that's progress. But if it turns out that Guatemalans can more cheaply do what you're doing, that somehow needs to be compensated. I mean,
right.
Sort of logically, that doesn't make sense, even if maybe politically it's necessary. Although, I mean, I think
so we need a much bigger welfare state that doesn't make any distinctions.
Not where I was going, but I suppose that's one way to take it. Well, the other thing is, I mean, it seems like the most recent sort of spurt of anti-outsourcing backlash. Right? I mean, it's like the big kind of thing now that's the expansion is not more manufacturing stuff shipping around, but more things like call centers and other kinds of services that used to be provided here that are going overseas. So it's not like the people at the bottom with the fewest sort of transferable skills that are kind of losing out in the near term. And it seems like a lot of the people who are kind of howling loudest, sort of programmers put out of work by Bangalore or whatever, have kind of rolled that back. I mean, I remember one of one of these unemployed programmers who had started one of these anti-offshoring groups essentially closed up shop because he realized that he in fact could find a better job. So he was out of work for a little while and then found another better job. So I don't know how deep the backlash is in this case.
Well, I think that what you're seeing is, I mean, I think people tend to wrongly think about the backlash in terms of who actually has lost their jobs. And over time, more people will. Alan Blinder, who's a prominent economist, is now estimating that about 40 million jobs are going to become vulnerable to outsourcing and probably be outsourced in the next couple of decades. But what I think you really do see is a sort of generalized anxiety. I mean, part of the reason, clearly, we have wage stagnation. Part of the reason that you're seeing salaries drop or not advance in the manufacturing, in the producing, in the retail sectors is because these things are getting done cheaper elsewhere. So how can you if you try to keep getting sort of pay increases we saw during the sort of post-war great wage increase and leveling in the 40s to late 70s. It would be cost effective. You'd actually lose your job. But so the other side of that is you don't lose your job, but it doesn't get better very quickly anymore, and you possibly have to do more work for the same amount of money, or possibly aren't getting wage increases in the way you should. I mean, median incomes in 2005, not median incomes in 2005 for the 90% of the from 0 to 90% on the income distribution, incomes actually went down on average by 0.6%. That's pretty impressive, I guess, and it's pretty worrying. I think that's where you see a lot of the anger coming from. It isn't just software programmers, and it isn't just people who lose their jobs directly, because that's a fairly small number. But a lot of folks are getting affected. The sort of middle-class squeeze people talk about has a lot to do with trade, and the question is, to some degree, I think how you either how you compensate them or how you alleviate their concerns or their anxieties, but something.
Well, at least they're paying less out of pocket on healthcare.
They're certainly not doing that.
Let me actually just throw out, just to bring it back to IP a little, I wanted to sort of add that one of the difficulties that I have with this is the same as the one I have with sort of labor environmental standards, which is that it seems like one of the points of having different countries is not just that we like lots of flags, but that it's useful to both have a kind of experimental, a system of experimenting with different kinds of legal rules and regimes. So on the one hand, you want to sort of see what kind of balance striking is best, but also that people may just have objectively different needs. And it just seems wildly implausible to me that the right to IP trade-off, right? I mean, IP always involves a trade-off. You kind of create this monopoly, but you incentivize production, and that, kind of what is the optimal balance there in terms of stimulating new intellectual property goods and allowing them to be disseminated, at the right price to the most number of people, is so contingent on so many things. Changing technology obviously upsets the balance in a lot of ways by making old IP a precursor to new goods much more easily. And the idea that the U.S. and China would have even remotely similar optimal balances just seems weird. Why would that be the case? Why would that
right.
any more than they would have the same tax rate be optimal?
No, I think that's potentially correct. I mean, as I said, I don't have strong opinions on trade because in the literature I've read, I can't come to really certainty on what it does or who it helps or who it hurts. I mean, but I tend to think it's pretty inevitable, and the question is just like, how do you help compensate the losers, and how do you try to make the winners better off, and do it without getting too much global inequality and so forth. So, but yeah, I mean, what you said doesn't strike me as incorrect. Should we move here?
Yeah, let's go to. We're creeping up on an hour. You want to sing on
creeping up an hour? Some
campaign
quick
finance?
campaign finance talk.
All right.
Okay, so last week you had the Democrats and the Republicans all come out, and everybody raised a ton of money. Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, Mitt Romney all raised over $20 million each in the first quarter. To give you an idea of how this works, okay? Hillary raised $26 million, Barack $25 million, and Edwards $15 million in the first quarter of 2007. In the first quarter of 2003, which would be the correct, comparison, Edwards stunned the field and broke out by outraising everybody with $7.3 million. This year, to get into third place, he doubled it. Money in politics is a problem. Julian, I don't think you would think so.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not, I guess, as incensed by things like sort of caps on donations as some of the libertarians are. My huge problem comes in when inevitably, in an attempt to close loopholes, as they're always called, people decide that these limits aren't meaningful unless you're also limiting independent spending on ads where people want to get their own political message out. But I do think. I don't know if this number still holds. It was true, back in '97. I guess we're breaking so many records that perhaps it's not true anymore. But I remember that there was one of the late '90s election cycles where the amount spent on all federal campaigning was slightly less than the amount Americans spent in the same year on Barbie dolls.
Right. I mean, you hear a variant of that a lot. That like.
Sure. Or potato chips.
That we spend more money advertising toothpaste every year. Ed Gillespie likes to say that, the RNC guy. Sure. And like the first I think 27 times I heard it, I thought, oh, haha, toothpaste. Politicians are more important than that. Although frankly, like I'm having some dental problems right now, and politicians are way less important than proper dental care. Take that to the bank, blocking heads people. But the sort of problem with that analogy is that I know how Crest is financing its really cool ads. It sells toothpaste. I don't know exactly, or I do know, but I don't like what politicians are selling to finance their cool campaigns, which are their positions on important issues to the highest bidder. That seems a problem. I will say that I think that Mark Schmidt, who's a blogging headster and a very, very bright guy, wrote an article in Democracy, a Journal of Ideas, in which he argued that what you really need is no longer to follow sort of constraining campaign finance reform strategies where, like you say, okay, no more donations for corporations, or they can only donate X amount. What you can do, though, is you can enhance, particularly with the rise of the Internet as a legitimate funding mechanism, you can enhance the power of small sum donors vis-a-vis corporations and rich people. So, like, if you donate $250, and only up to $250,
Right.
It really counts as like 1,000 or something, or it's doubled or tripled or whatever, which seems smart to me. I'm not. If we could create, at a certain point, having more money creates diminishing returns, and I think we're reaching that point for a lot of these folks. And if we can make it, a more legitimate funding strategy to just like get people online pretty excited and have them donate a bunch of cash, and then we could, multiply that a couple times, and they had enough money to compete with, corporate-funded Zombie Boy #2, I'd be okay with that. And I'm curious if you would as well.
Well, I mean, I know. I mean, already the Obama number. I mean, he raised what 25 million, and I know something like actually a little more than a third of that came from online donations, and I think about half of the a third of the sum, half of the donors, and it seems like the trend is already
right
in the direction of large numbers of small donations. On the essentially if the real problem we have is so sort of this way, we have two things. One, we actually do want politicians, I think, to spend money on campaigning, right? I mean,
right.
If you do polls of what people know about about candidates and their stands on issues and things like that, it's pretty appalling, right? It's like people.
Well,
like
it's a good
us
question whether or not the money they spend on campaigning actually aids that.
Well, I mean that's fair. That's a fair question, and but I think although people sort of rag on negative ads, I think one of the functions of negative ads is to call attention to people's positions, bad or good.
Right.
But I mean, so it's clear that like freaks like us maybe pay lots of attention to people like Sam Brownback and Mitt Romney before they start campaigning, but most people don't, and so Romney is not so he's sort of behind in the polls in terms of the who Republicans like, but leading in fundraising, and I think not that I have any particular fondness for Romney specifically. I'm just saying if it weren't the case that he were able to have that kind of advantage and that ability to spend a ton of money trying to get his name out and his face out, it would only be people like McCain or Giuliani who, for whatever reason, have these kind of high media profiles and so don't need to spend money. The other thing is,
I agree. Sorry, go on.
So the money itself, right, is not a problem. Right? We actually want money spent to inform people. The other thing, so if the problem we have is not with the money, it's with this, the idea of the quid pro quo. I mean, I think if we spent as much, effort on policing the quo as we do, trying to limit money, which seems like it's going to find its way in no matter what you do, I think we could get better outcomes or the same outcome. If you have transparency combined with aggressive attempts to kind of highlight the connections between whether people have changed their stand in response to money they've gotten, I think that's that's where the check comes in. But I also don't know that it's the question is whether it is a quid pro quo, right? I mean, if someone is a really vocal advocate for an issue that some industry or some wealthy individual cares about,
right.
It's not actually suspicious or problematic to me that someone says, I like this candidate, he supports the things I support or that are good for me or whatever, and I want to help him get his message out, right? Vote buying we have a problem with, but the idea that people are just supporting who they agree with I don't think is necessarily problematic. I think we want to sort of keep separate this idea of essentially vote buying and just that people who have money to spend will support people they agree with.
Yeah, I don't totally know how you police the quo effectively. I'd also say Mitt Romney, I think, is a good example of the opposite, too, right? Like, he's unknown, and how did he raise a ton of money? Well, partially it was the Mormon community, but partially the dude knows a lot of investment bankers, and that will, I assume, given that they're all giving a lot of money to him, and he probably agrees with them. He was an investment banker, but I think he's a pretty clear, I don't like the idea that two ways to get known in politics are to become a national media star or to, be a corporate tool. But I tend to think, too, as you say, Barack Obama is sort of forging somewhat of a new trail here. He's not taking PAC money and lobbyist money at the very least. And, I think that if you could ease that way a little bit through allowing small donor democracy to flourish, even when the people may not be quite as, megawatt as Barack Obama, I think that we would, be better off. I also think, obviously, transparency and so forth are good, and, but I think it is a problem because you really don't know how to. I really don't think we can ever decide when somebody's doing the quid or the pro or the quo. I mean, that's the issue, right? So, but I think that things are actually getting better, and sort of the rise of the internet and so forth, and the net roots, so to speak, have actually created a situation in which I think it is becoming less of a concern, even as the dollar amounts go ever larger.
Mm-hmm.
But,
at the end of the day, the truth is, I think, if someone is sort of determined to be corrupt, I don't know what you can do. I mean, I don't know how you're going to stop someone from taking a lucrative position on the board of some company they helped after they leave office, if that's the understanding.
Sure, right. I mean, it's a fair point.
But I also want to know, just in terms of the non-small donor aspect, I mean, I actually think, like, Ross Perot was sort of a freak, but made that election interesting. And I actually, one thing I do kind of like about, sort of more unrestricted, sort of high-dollar donations is that, well, because Perot just had a hell of a lot of money of his own that he was allowed to spend because of the Supreme Court essentially says spending your own money is not subject to these limitations, and so was able to kind of come out of nowhere and inject a perspective into the race that whatever else he thought of it was different, and we've seen other Teddy Roosevelt's like bull moose candidacy was and Gene McCarthy's I don't know if these are examples to hold up as paragons or whatever, but they were sort of interesting kind of outsider candidates who were able to convince a small number of people who believed in them to make them sort of realistic contenders. And I don't know, I think American politics is more interesting for that. It might make more sense if we had a proportional system or just anything basically other than first past the post, winner take all. Because then that kind of variety would actually, might have some meaningful purchase as opposed to creating more spoilers. But I like the idea of this kind of political entrepreneurship where if you can get a couple really intensely interested people, you can inject yourself in without necessarily having this huge name recognition or kind of cachet.
I'm not against that, and I think on that note of comedy, we should call it a day.
Sounds good. All right. I will probably see you at a bar sometime soon.
I'm sure. All right. Always a pleasure, Julian.
Cheers.
Later.